Welcome back, Bib 1001. Great to be seen by you once again as we continue to work through these early chapters in Exodus. Moses grows up in the palace and he goes out one day. He knows who his people are. He was at home, raised by his mom long enough to know who his own people were. And so he went out one day to where the Hebrews were at, and he saw an Egyptian man beating up a Hebrew man, working him ruthlessly. And Moses interceded and ended up killing the Egyptian man. He hid him in the sand, hoping that no one would see, that no one would know. He goes out the next day, and now he sees two Hebrew men fighting against each other. And he tries to intervene and stop the fight. And one of them asks, "Who made you a ruler over us? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" Moses knows that the murder he committed has been found out, and he is fearful for his life, and so he runs. And he flees to the desert. He leaves Egypt, and he actually ends up becoming a shepherd, and he gets married and has a couple kids. And so Moses is done with Egypt. He's done with his own people. He is content to be a shepherd out in the wilderness and to raise his family and belong to a family. Well, about this time, we come to the close of Exodus chapter 2, and the Pharaoh dies. There's a new Pharaoh in charge, and the people begin to groan and to cry out, and God hears their cry. So let me go ahead and share screen with you, share text with you, and we will get to, let's see, sharing it. And that's not quite what I wanted. Here we go. And so here we are in Exodus 3, and I'll back it up just a little bit. Here we go. So during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. And so the emphasis here is that they finally have enough hope to cry out. And they cry desperately. God hears their cry. God remembers. And whenever God remembers, that's usually a pretty good thing in the Old Testament. It means God's about to act, just like God remembered Noah. So now God remembers his promise. He remembers his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God sees, God knows, God's going to respond. And so we come to chapter 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, "I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned." When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." And he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Now, we'll look at the rest of the chapter in lectures to come, but I want to focus on these first 6 verses. First thing I want to talk about is that burning bush, that the Lord appeared to Moses in the burning bush. And the thing that caught Moses' attention is that the bush was on fire, but it wasn't consumed. Now, you would think that if a bush was on fire, the fire would consume it and the bush would be no more. And yet here it is on fire, bush still there, fire continues to burn, bush not consumed. And God is speaking to him from out of the midst, out of the center of this burning bush. Does this bush that's on fire but not being consumed, does it remind you of anything or anyone? Let me help a little bit. How about Exodus 1? Remember what's going on with the people? The people, the Israelites, they're being oppressed. They're going through a fiery ordeal, and yet they're not consumed by it. In fact, they're multiplying. And so many have argued that what's going on with this bush is very symbolic of what's going on with the people of Israel, that they're being oppressed, that you would think that the oppression would eliminate them, would consume them, And yet what we find happening is that in the midst of their fiery oppression, they are not consumed, but they are multiplying, much like this bush. You would expect the fire would consume it and leave nothing but ashes, and yet the bush is still there. And God is actually present in the bush and speaking to Moses from the bush. Could it be that God is actually present in the midst of Israel, in the midst of their oppression, their fiery ordeal that they're going through? And the reason why they're not consumed is because God is with them, present in the midst. So that's one way that people understand the burning bush, that, yeah, it's a bush that's there that's on fire, but maybe representing what's going on with the children of Israel and the oppression that they're under. The next thing I want to call your attention to, Moses turns aside to go see it, and the Lord begins to speak to him out of the bush, calls his name, and then verse 5, do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place of which you are standing or on which you are standing is holy ground. Now, we need to talk about this a little bit. My imagination starts to run wild here, but God telling Moses that he needs to take his sandals off, that he needs to be barefoot on holy ground. Well, what makes the ground holy is the presence of God. And so he's in the presence of God, and God's saying, Moses, take your shoes off, take your sandals off. This ground is holy. I am here. My presence is here. Why must he take his sandals off? Well, basic answer would be a sign of respect. But I've put together a little PowerPoint to try to explain at least the way I end up thinking about this. Now, what you have in front of you are pictures of Converse All-Stars from back in the 70s and 80s, back when I played. And so when I was junior high, high school in the 70s, a lot of times we'd wear Converse All-Stars, the Chuck Taylors, the shoe that's on your left there. And those would run you about $20 or so. We'd actually play basketball in those. I know nobody plays basketball in those today. Indoors, outdoors, we tore those shoes up. We played a lot. In the early 80s, Converse came out with their leather basketball shoe. It was called the Weapon. There might have been some of it out in the around 79, 78, but it was their Weapon. It was probably about a $40 to $50 shoe. Okay, but a lot of times, you know, you're playing in the cheap ones. You might graduate up to play in the leather ones, but again, that's about $50. Adidas. This was my shoe of choice. The one on your right, the high top, that's referred to as the Pro model, and played in that in college. And those were about $55, and great shoe. In fact, I had to put a second picture up there. Such a good shoe. Then you're wondering, okay, well, what about Nike? Well, Nike had the Blazer, and it was, again, about a $55 shoe. And those were pretty good shoes. And those days, Nike wasn't quite on top of the market yet. Adidas was holding steady, and Converse. And then about 82, 83, the Air Force Ones came out from Nike. Now, these were the first $100 shoes. Up until this point, you paid $50, $55 for a pair of shoes. These shoes came out. They were the first shoes in triple figures, the first shoes over $100, and they were impressive. And what I began to notice, you know, you're going through warm-ups and you're checking out your opponent, and you're checking out their gear. You're noticing what kind of shoes they had on. And what I began to discover is that a lot of times the guys that had the $100 shoes, the Air Force Ones, all that money, they really only had about a $20 game. And that they spent all this money on their shoes to try to dress their game up, and their game was really no better than anybody else's, sometimes worse. So $100 shoes, $20 game, and it's like they were just faking it. And I kind of think that maybe that's what God is getting at with Moses in terms of take off your shoes. That Moses, take off your shoes, you are standing on holy ground. That there's no room, there's no place for dressing yourself up, dressing your game up when you're in the presence of God. You got to be who you are. There's no room for pretension. There's no room for pretending that you're more than what you are. And so, Moses, you're in my presence. Take off your shoes, take off your sandals. You're on holy ground. Maybe another way to look at it is who makes shoes? Those are a human product. Who makes feet? Well, really, those are a God product. That when we are in the presence of God, we can't make stuff to make ourselves look better than we are, or that stuff simply gets between us and God. That when we're in the presence of God, that stuff has to be done with, and we simply come into God's presence as we are. And so, Moses, take off your shoes. You're standing on holy ground. I think that's the only way to enter into the presence of God, to enter as we are. There's no room for pretension, no room for making ourselves out to be better than what we are. So Moses is there, and we see that he's afraid of God. I think you and I would be as well, in terms of this overwhelming presence in this bush on fire that's not being consumed. And so we see this going on, and we see that Moses is going to comply, and then God is going to begin to speak to Moses from the bush, and he's going to tell Moses what he's got in store for him. He's going to call Moses. We'll look at that on the next one. For now, thank you for hanging in here and for watching these videos, and we will get back to you with more of Exodus 3.